On Christmas Eve, the wind didn't just howl through the streets of Boston, it whispered warnings. It knifed through the alleys and avenues, sharp and bitter, carrying the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen but lingered in the air like a promise. Downtown glowed with holiday life. Frantic shoppers darting past store windows, bundled carolers singing into the frost, golden lights reflecting in puddles turned to ice. Inside cafes, couples clinked wine glasses. Laughter mingled with the familiar strains of Silent Night, barely audible over honking horns and the rush of cabs. It was the kind of night where joy felt inevitable, the kind of night where anything, even miracles, felt possible. But 20 miles north, beyond the city's glow, at the edge of a quiet wooded estate, none of that warmth could pierce the walls of the Rains' property. The mansion rose like a stone monolith against the snow-dusted trees, its perimeter watched by armed men whose eyes never stopped moving. Security lights blinked in synchronized rhythm, cameras turned silently on high steel posts. And in the master suite on the second floor, Jonathan Rains stood behind a bulletproof pane of glass, watching the sun bleed into the horizon violet and ash over untouched snow. The silence inside wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. 3 floors of marble and granite, immaculate and untouched. Every painting perfectly hung, every corridor gleaming. It was a home built for control, and like all things too tightly held it no longer breathed. And yet, just down the hall, in a room painted pale yellow and cluttered with blocks, crayons, and lopsided paper snowflakes, 2 6-year-old twins were picking out sweaters, giggling in silence, completely unaware that their father had spent the last 72 hours turning their dinner outing into a fully staffed security op. To them, it was just Christmas Eve, a night of lights, maybe cocoa, maybe snow. To him, it was the first time in their lives they would set foot beyond the gates, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was waiting for them not to come back. If you are listening to this and feel that the story touches something quiet and unspoken inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video, so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every single day. And if it is not too much to ask, tell me where you are watching from, and leave a comment below so we know which corner of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share with us. Jonathan still stood there with his hand resting gently against the cold pane of glass, his gaze drifting past the snow-covered trees that were slowly dissolving into the darkness, and though the scene before him belonged to the present moment, his mind had slipped back to another night, another winter, another Christmas, the final night he ever spent with his wife. Amelia had smiled at him in the delivery room, her hand weak but warm as it curled around his finger, whispering "I love you" before her eyes closed forever. The twins, Ellie and Noah, arrived only a few minutes after that goodbye, a beginning born directly from the moment his greatest love came to an end, and the loss cracked something inside him, leaving behind a hollow space no one could ever touch, let alone fill. After the funeral, he vanished from the world, cutting off everything and everyone. No press, no public, no relatives or friends, only a fortress of a mansion, built to isolate, to protect, and to control. He refused all offers of help, even from trusted allies in his old life, because the outside world had become a threat, a place where enemies could rise from any shadow, and his children were the only weakness he could not bear to expose. When doctors diagnosed Ellie and Noah as profoundly deaf at birth, he shed no tears and spoke no bitter words. He simply tightened his grip on the edge of the hospital bed and walked out to order the entire second floor, rebuilt into a sealed sanctuary designed for them alone. Every sound in the house was adjusted to support sign language learning. A private teacher moved in permanently, and yet from that moment, an invisible line formed between Jonathan and the children, not drawn by coldness but by a suffocating kind of protection. He loved them with what remained of a heart that had hardened under grief, but he knew no language of affection except control. He saw that they loved to draw, so he bought them hundreds of colored pens. He saw that Ellie loved snow, so he built a miniature garden with artificial snowfall. But he never once ran with them in that garden, or lay on the floor to listen to the silent dreams of 2 deaf children who only wanted someone to understand them. And the children loved him too, with the instinctive devotion children give to the one person who makes them feel safe. But they did not know that Jonathan's fear was no ordinary fear. He did not fear illness or accidents. He feared the ghosts of names and debts, and vanished enemies who had never truly disappeared. Every time he looked at his children, he saw not only Ellie and Noah, but also the shadow of Amelia, and the echo of her last plea inside him. Do not let them grow up in fear the way you did. Yet he had failed her, building a life where every decision meant to protect them also imprisoned them. Now, as they eagerly chose sweaters for their first outing beyond the gates, Something inside him twisted, not from weather or danger but from the painful truth that he, the father who loved them more than his own life, had also been the one to lock their childhood away, and he wondered whether he himself was the one who needed release. Meanwhile, in a small neighborhood on the south side of Boston, Rachel Carter wiped down the final table of her shift at Marino's, her brown hair tied back, her apron stained with tomato sauce, and she smiled warmly at the elderly couple heading out without revealing the 8 hours of exhaustion pressing on her shoulders. The restaurant lights were still bright, but the music had softened from its dinner rush pulse. She checked the clock. Nearly 9 o'clock. She needed to get home before her 14-year-old brother Ethan began to worry. He had never heard his own name spoken aloud. Yet he was the only soundless presence in her life that made her feel needed. Orphaned at 11, Rachel had stepped into adulthood long before she was ready, abandoning community college to work any job she could, server, tutor, babysitter, anything that allowed her to bring Ethan to and from the school for deaf children safely. Ethan was her entire world, bright and energetic, with eyes that seemed hungry for every beautiful thing life offered, even though his world had always been wrapped in silence. Rachel learned sign language not because she had to, but because she never wanted him to feel alone. Each gesture a heartbeat of devotion, each movement saying, "I am here, I hear you," even without sound. Every day she rose before dawn, packed lunches, walked him to school, then raced to Marino's for her shift, and on snowy nights she walked nearly 20 minutes from the bus stop to their apartment, because taxi fare was a luxury she could not afford. But she never complained. She carried a quiet but persistent belief that kindness and perseverance would eventually return something good. The little apartment was humble, yet filled with laughter and handwritten notes in sign language taped everywhere. Her heart was gentle, but her will was unbreakable. And though she knew her life did not belong to elegant dining rooms or armored mansions, she never felt small. In truth, that honesty and resilience made her stand out far more than she realized. A soft light in a cold and hurried city, the kind of light that would one day shake the steel walls around Jonathan Raines's guarded heart. As she stored the mop and pulled the final receipt from her notepad, she had no idea that in only a few minutes, her life would collide with a world she had never imagined, a world of armored vehicles, suspicious glances, and 2 lonely children aching for someone who understood them. She did not yet know that her presence, a simple waitress living in a rented apartment, would forever alter the lives of people who seemed impossibly far from her own. But fate always chooses the strangest moments to turn a page, and for Rachel Carter, that Christmas night was the quiet opening line of a coming miracle. In the underground operations room of the Raines estate, the glow of a large monitor washed over the stern features of David Chen as he reviewed the digital map displaying the route from the mansion to Marino's, every turn marked, every potential stop equipped with an alternate plan. On the table lay 3 handheld radios, 2 encrypted phones, and a printed schedule broken down minute by minute. Jonathan stood behind him with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the map, though his thoughts drifted elsewhere. For 6 years he had kept his children inside, never once crossing the iron gates, not out of preference but survival. His enemies did not sleep, they merely went quiet. Even dissolved networks carried grudges, and blood debts rarely faded. Yet Ellie and Noah were old enough now to need a world larger than reinforced walls. They needed real lights, a real winter sky, the feeling of cold air on their cheeks. Jonathan knew this, but fear had grown roots inside him. David pointed to camera feeds placed along the main route. 6 operatives disguised as civilians, 2 scout vehicles ahead, 1 decoy vehicle behind, and the central SUV armored and fitted with hidden tracking, driven by a trained veteran. Estimated travel time 18 minutes without delays. Marino's entrance would be swept beforehand, staff vetted, unfamiliar patrons limited. If anything went wrong, the intervention team would arrive within 15 seconds. Jonathan nodded silently. He did not need reminders about the risks or calculations about the odds. He thought only of Ellie's question signed earlier in the day. Does real snow look like the movies, Dad? And he had been unable to answer because the truth inside that question carried the weight of something he had taken from them. David watched him quietly, aware that Jonathan was fighting not just enemies but himself. 6 years was a long time for children to live in the muted world of safety, yet too short for a father terrified of losing anyone else. David asked one final time, "Are you sure?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. He stared at the red dot marking Marino's on the map, then at the photo of Ellie and Noah laughing on the playroom floor, paper scraps scattered like confetti around them, their eyes full of anticipation rather than fear. He stepped forward, picked up the encrypted phone, and said softly, "Begin preparation." As he walked out, his footsteps echoing through the cold stone corridor. Something faint and unfamiliar stirred in him for the first time in years. A fragile thread of hope twisted tightly with fear, and he understood with painful clarity that if anything went wrong he could lose everything. But if he kept his children trapped behind glass, he was losing them already. And on that Christmas night he knew he had to choose between a love that hid in the shadows and the courage required to open the door. The second-floor playroom glowed beneath a wash of soft golden light, its walls crowded with childish drawings and its floor scattered with colored pencils, wooden blocks, stuffed animals, and scraps of craft paper. Ellie crouched beside a low wooden cabinet, pulling open drawer after drawer and admiring each sweater she lifted into her hands, her eyes shining beneath a tumble of unruly hair, while Noah lay sprawled across the carpet, one hand propping his chin and the other sketching uneven blue snowflakes onto a blank sheet of paper. A draft slipped through the window frame and sent the hanging paper streamers swaying gently, and the only sounds in the room were the rustle of paper and the breathless laughter of two children who could not hear their own joy. Ellie turned and held up two sweaters, one red with a reindeer pattern and one blue with the word joy sparkling across the front, then signed to her brother asking which was more beautiful for their night out. Noah looked up, pretending to furrow his brow in deep contemplation before pointing at the reindeer sweater, and Ellie burst into a silent laugh, rushing over to pull him upright. They could not hear Christmas bells or festive music the way other children could, yet in their own quiet world, the excitement, the glow, and the wonder of the holiday shimmered just as brightly. Miss Ellis entered carrying a large picture book, her hair pinned neatly, her manner calm as always, though a warmth she rarely displayed softened her eyes. She sat down beside them, placed the book across her lap, and lifted her hand to signal them closer. Both children scooted toward her at once. She signed slowly, telling them that tonight they would visit a place called a restaurant, and asked whether they knew what that was. Noah shook his head. Ellie asked whether a restaurant was like a kitchen, and Miss Ellis smiled as she opened the first page to reveal an illustration of a family seated around a table with steaming dishes, a server delivering plates, and warm golden light hanging overhead. She explained that a restaurant was a place people went to eat food that someone else cooked, where they could choose what they liked. Ellie's eyes widened, and she asked if there were sweets, and Miss Ellis nodded and added that there was often hot chocolate. Noah leapt to his feet, signing with frantic enthusiasm that he wanted pizza loaded with cheese and ice cream afterward. Miss Ellis tapped his hand affectionately and reminded him that ice cream might be possible if he behaved well. Ellie folded the reindeer sweater neatly and laid it upon the bed, then turned to her brother with her eyes shimmering as she asked whether they were truly going outside. The question needed no answer because the hope in her expression spoke for her. For 6 years their world had been contained within silent rooms, quiet hallways, and a sky glimpsed only through bulletproof glass. But tonight that door would open. They would step into a world they had only known through picture books and short videos Miss Ellis played on the screen. A world of real snow, real lights, real people, and real cake. Miss Ellis felt her throat tighten as she looked at them, remembering the first signs they ever learned, the loneliness she had watched them carry, and their yearning to live the way other children did. She knew this outing was not simply a meal, but the first fragile doorway into the world, a door opened by all the courage a fearful father could summon. She said nothing more, simply gathered both children into her arms, and in that embrace, with winter wind whispering beyond the window, something warmer than snow spread through the little room. The sleek black SUV rolled through the iron gates under the cold gold of Christmas night, snow drifting down in feathery spirals that melted upon the armored glass, and the lead scout vehicles glided ahead while a support car followed behind, the convoy holding formation with the precision of a trained unit. In the rear cabin, Ellie and Noah sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pressed close to the window as the muted glow of streetlights touched their eyes for the very first time. Ellie pointed at the bare winter trees sliding past and signed to Noah in delight that there were more trees here than in their garden, and Noah nodded vigorously, tracing the outline of a house with chimney smoke in the air beside him, his gaze locked on the ever-changing world rushing by. Low buildings rose into taller ones, traffic lights blinked red and yellow and green, buses rumbled past, cyclists maneuvered through the cold, and bundled pedestrians hurried along clutching bright gift bags. Everything pulsed with life, motion, and color, far more vivid than anything the children had seen in books or on screens. Jonathan watched them from the front seat, seeing how their fingers danced feverishly as they pointed out each discovery, their eyes glowing as though holding galaxies, and the mixture of joy and fear clenched his heart. Each minute on the road tested a trust he had never allowed himself before. David sat beside him, silent, ears attuned to the team's communications, eyes shifting over the incoming signals. All checkpoints remained clear, nothing unusual, yet Jonathan felt unease coiling low inside him, a learned instinct from years lived in the dark where long stretches of quiet rarely meant safety. Even so, he kept his expression steady. When Ellie signed a question asking what a certain place was, he followed her gesture, then smiled faintly and explained with signs that it was a gas station where cars drank water to keep moving. She laughed silently behind her hand and repeated the message to Noah, who leaned against her, shaking with soundless laughter. Jonathan straightened, his gaze drifting toward the windshield and beyond, wondering when he had last seen such carefree joy on their faces, realizing he perhaps never had. At the mansion, every happiness had been filtered through layers of protection. But here, in a city brimming with strangers and risk, the children were, for the first time, simply alive. Boston unfolded ahead like a vibrant tapestry of Christmas lights, sparkling windows, costumed Santas handing out candy, hurried adults, and children darting through the cold, and Ellie pressed her cheek to the glass, signing to Noah that it looked just like a fairy tale. Jonathan absorbed the sight, the small flame of fear still burning inside him, knowing only minutes remained before he would surrender control and trust the world he had long believed hostile. He sensed how tired he had grown of fighting a war that had ended years earlier, how danger no longer lived only outside but inside the heart of a father who had forgotten how to love freely. The SUV turned down a narrow street where the warm glow of merinos shimmered like a single hopeful candle. Jonathan tightened his grip on the seat frame and inhaled deeply. His battles were far from over, yet tonight he allowed himself a brief pause so his children could taste life and so he could remember the shape of trust. Inside merinos, the air felt like a warm magnet pulling people in from the winter night, scented with toasted bread, rosemary, and garlic drifting from the kitchen, wrapped in the gentle strains of old Christmas melodies floating from a speaker behind the bar. White tablecloths draped each table, candle flames flickered against glasses of deep red wine, and the bright chatter of families rose and fell with the clink of cutlery, creating a chorus of celebration. Children dashed around a tall Christmas tree, nibbling snowman cookies, their cheeks pink from the cold, while adults lifted glasses, embraced one another, and traded genuine smiles. Rachel moved swiftly among the tables, balancing a tray piled with drinks and menus, her hair fallen loose so that a few strands clung to her perspiring forehead, yet her face remained luminously kind. She bent to speak with an elderly woman and gently adjusted the scarf, slipping from her shoulders, before turning with the same warm smile to another table. Though her legs ached from the long day, she poured her heart into every gesture. Christmas offered no rest for her, but it gifted her glimpses of beauty, reunion, gratitude, and humanity woven through each handshake and simple holiday wish. Behind the bar, Tommy Marino stood with arms crossed, observing the room through a large wall mirror, a compact man with sharp eyes, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and the steady presence of someone who had seen much. When he noticed a young employee reaching for menus to approach table 7, he tilted his head to summon Rachel. She came quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, still scanning the room. He told her quietly that she alone would serve table 7. Rachel paused, looked up at him, considered asking why, then stopped herself. Tommy Marino never issued instructions without purpose. She nodded, retrieved the menus, and felt a flicker of curiosity gather in her chest. Table 7 sat near the large window, a little more secluded, with softer lighting and a clear view of the street. As Rachel approached, the black SUV had just pulled up outside. She did not recognize the vehicle, but something in her instincts stirred, telling her these guests would not be like the usual patrons of Marinos. The door opened. The 2 children stepped out first, and then a tall man followed, his expression stern, his posture straight, his gaze sweeping the restaurant as though memorizing every detail. Rachel did not know who he was, yet her heartbeat slowed in an odd, instinctive reaction. Something was different, not dangerous, but watchful. She held her tray steady without thinking. When the group entered, the surrounding noise seemed to recede. No one else noticed, but she did. She caught the brief glances cast their way, saw how a few older customers paused their conversations before looking quickly aside. The man exchanged a few words with the host and was led to table 7 where Rachel waited. She bowed slightly in greeting, her eyes absorbing the children first. There was something unusual about them. Not in their elegant clothes, but in their gaze, quiet yet alight with wonder as though the world was entirely new. And just as Rachel opened her mouth to speak, Ellie signed a question to Noah, her fingers moving with such natural ease that Rachel froze, a tight ache blooming in her chest as she realized she had stepped into something far deeper than an ordinary Christmas shift. Before she could react, Jonathan Rains settled into his seat across from the children, his eyes fixed on her with a look that held equal parts examination and caution. Rachel straightened, grounding herself. She did not yet know which door she had just stepped through, but every instinct whispered the same message: do not turn away. The story of this night had not begun, yet something irreversible had already shifted. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she looked from Ellie to Noah and then to the man seated across from them, who watched her with an unreadable expression, his eyes following every movement as though measuring, evaluating, or waiting for a misstep. She inhaled slowly, set the tray gently on the edge of the table, then lowered herself to her knees so she was level with the children, her expression softening into a smile that sought no attention yet radiated sincerity, and in a moment that appeared deceptively ordinary, she signed slowly, "Hello, my name is Rachel. I will be serving your dinner tonight." Noah froze, his wide eyes shining as if he had just witnessed magic, and Ellie blinked rapidly before turning to sign to her brother. "She understands." Both children looked back at Rachel and burst into silent laughter, their little faces glowing like Christmas lights switched on all at once, and Rachel felt her entire body ease, warmth rippling down her spine. She signed again, asking whether they were ready to order, mentioning pizza, spaghetti, and even ice cream, and Noah nodded so hard his hair went wild while Ellie signed a flurry of excited replies. Rachel noticed every detail, the precision of their expressions, the fluency of their hands, evidence that they had been taught well, and yet something about their delight carried the unmistakable weight of first-time recognition by someone outside their home. Jonathan watched wordlessly, his mind filling with questions: who this young woman was, why she knew ASL, why her response was so instinctive, and whether she was connected to something he had not anticipated. From a distance, David also observed, pretending to check his phone while cataloging every nuance of Rachel's expression, fully aware that everything in their security plan accounted for predictable variables except the unknown tenderness of a waitress who signed fluently. Rachel kept her attention on the children, asking whether they were cold and whether they wanted hot chocolate before dinner. Ellie signed back that she had never had hot chocolate outside her home, and Noah pointed toward the large Christmas tree, signing that it was more beautiful than any tree he had seen. And Rachel laughed softly, her heart melting at the purity of their joy. In that moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, the bustle of a holiday shift dissolving into the background. She ceased to be an exhausted waitress, and instead became part of the children's first real memory of the world beyond insulated walls. Jonathan took it all in, his mind taut as wire, struggling to understand why Ellie's laughter struck him so deeply, and why Noah leaned forward eagerly to sign more. This was the first time they had ever spoken freely with a stranger, and he, who had spent years shielding them from danger, found himself unable to follow the swift movement of their small hands, his own basic understanding of ASL paling beside Rachel's fluency. When Rachel stood and said gently aloud that she would return with drinks and appetizers, encouraging them to keep talking, she walked away, leaving behind a table changed entirely by her presence. Ellie turned to Noah and signed, "I like her," and though Jonathan was not skilled at reading emotions, he felt the truth of it. He also sensed that tonight might bring far more than he had planned. Rachel returned only a few minutes later, though for the twins the time felt like an hour, and both sat upright, eyes wandering around the restaurant but repeatedly darting back toward the counter where she had stood. As she placed the drinks on the table, Ellie immediately began to sign so quickly that Rachel leaned down to catch the motion. The girl asking when Rachel had learned ASL, whether she had deaf friends, and firing off questions as though afraid the chance might slip away. Instead of answering aloud, Rachel signed carefully, clearly, telling them she had a younger brother who had been deaf since birth, that she had grown up with him and learned ASL as a child, and that it had always felt like her most natural language. Ellie stilled for 2 seconds, and then something broke open in her small body as she suddenly began to cry, silent but shaking, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jonathan sprang forward, rising halfway from his seat, but Rachel lifted her hand in a gentle, calming gesture, her gaze never leaving Ellie's trembling face. The girl straightened and signed rapidly through tears, that never before had anyone outside her home understood her, that she had never imagined a stranger, a waitress, could speak to her so effortlessly. Rachel moved closer, kneeling again, wiping a tear from Ellie's cheek and signing softly that she was glad to meet them tonight and that the world was wide, full of people like them waiting to be seen. Noah sat still, eyes round, clutching a napkin in his hand as though anchoring himself as something tender unfurled in his chest. Jonathan found himself overwhelmed. He, who had spent years managing every detail, predicting every variable, shielding his children from every threat, was suddenly powerless before a moment he had not orchestrated. He saw Ellie smile through tears, Noah squeeze her hand, and Rachel's hands shaping kindness in the air, and something stirred in him, gratitude and mistrust and fear mingling with a deeper pulse beneath it, the faint awakening of a heart long unused. Rachel rose, set Jonathan's glass before him, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met, sending a small hitch through his breath, before she turned away without expecting thanks, moving with the quiet certainty of someone doing what was simply right. Jonathan looked again at the children, Ellie's cheeks still damp but glowing, Noah nodding happily while clutching his napkin like a treasure, and he realized he could not recall a time they had been this joyful. 6 years of keeping them safe had not produced what 1 hour outside had brought, all because a woman spoke to them in the language of their hearts. He could not name the feeling rising inside him, but he knew something had shifted tonight, not in his plans but within himself. Dinner unfolded with an unexpected warmth, as if Rachel's presence had thawed the cold vigilance that had shadowed the table for years. Ellie and Noah devoured cheesy bread and hot soup, then spaghetti with an enthusiasm both innocent and contagious, pausing often to sign new questions to Rachel about the food or the glowing decorations, and she answered each with fluid, graceful hands. Jonathan ate quietly, watching her moves, occasionally letting his gaze soften upon Ellie's radiant face, yet never abandoning the cautious threads winding through his thoughts. A waitress fluent in ASL was rare, but possible. What unsettled him was her instinctive ease, the unspoken understanding she carried, the way she bridged into his children's world as if she had always belonged there. He distrusted coincidence, and refused to trust anyone whose history he did not know. When the meal ended, Rachel approached with the bill tucked inside a brown leather folder, and Jonathan did not need to scan the total. He slipped a bill worth several times the amount inside, along with a stark white card bearing only his name, Jonathan Rains. No title, no phone number, no address, just a name weighted with unspoken meaning. Rachel blinked at the generous tip, but it was the card that made her pause. She lifted her gaze and met Jonathan's eyes, which held neither warmth nor coldness, only deliberate observation. Without a word of thanks or farewell, he nodded once, motioned to the children, and rose. Ellie and Noah signed goodnight to Rachel, prompting her to smile and sign back that she hoped to see them again soon. As they departed, David, seated in the dim corner throughout the evening, lifted his phone and quietly took a photograph of the card in Rachel's hand. Having tracked every reaction, every glance, every shift in the children's expressions. When Jonathan passed him, David stood and followed, silent until they reached the SUV. The car lights brightened, illuminating Jonathan's solemn features as he settled into the back seat. David sat beside him, scrolling through the images and speaking in a low voice meant only for him, explaining that Rachel's ASL was fluent. Her signing was not professional like a teacher's but personal, ingrained, likely learned young, not fabricated, yet because of that very intimacy, her presence could not be dismissed as harmless. Jonathan said nothing at first, staring through the window at the snow drifting down in delicate flakes before turning toward David, his tone quiet but resolute as he ordered him to investigate everything about Rachel Carter, her past, her home, her family, her work history, all of it, because he needed to know who she was and why she had appeared at this precise moment. David nodded once, understood. As the SUV rolled toward the northern suburbs, Ellie's head slipped onto Noah's shoulder as she drifted into sleep with a faint lingering smile, and Jonathan watched her reflection in the glass, feeling an unfamiliar mix of relief and heaviness. He did not know who Rachel was, but she had entered his world like a strange wind, and for a man who had lived too long in the shadows, any wind could be a blessing or a storm. The next morning, inside the study, David placed a thin folder on Jonathan's desk. "Clean," David said, his voice measured. "Rachel Carter, orphaned at 11. She fought the state for 3 years to keep custody of her brother Ethan. She works double shifts, not for luxury, but to pay for his specialized schooling." Jonathan opened the file, his eyes scanning the documents. No debts, no criminal ties. But what caught his attention wasn't the lack of dirt, it was the grit. A police report from 2 years ago showed she had physically blocked a mugger from taking her brother's hearing aids, taking a hit meant for the boy. Jonathan ran his thumb over the paper. She was not just a waitress, she was a guardian. She understood what it meant to stand between the world and the one you love. "Make the call," he said finally, closing the file. "But double the surveillance." That night, after finishing her shift and returning to the small third-floor apartment in an aging Dorchester building. Rachel was pouring hot water into a teapot when her phone rang, the number unfamiliar, and she nearly let it ring a third time before answering. Her voice edged with the fatigue of a long shift as she said, "Hello, this is Rachel." A low, courteous male voice came through, firm enough to make it impossible to dismiss. "Good evening, Miss Carter. My name is David Chen. We have not met formally, but I believe you remember the dinner at Marino's tonight." Rachel tightened her hold on the phone, her instincts warning her that this was no ordinary call. "I remember," she replied cautiously. "I am calling on behalf of Mr. Jonathan Rains. He would like to offer you a position if you are interested." Rachel frowned and wrapped her hand around her warm cup, her pulse quickening for reasons she could not name. "I am a waitress, Mr. Chen. If this is about private dining service, I am not the right person." David paused a measured beat. Not service, interaction. Then he explained clearly and succinctly. Jonathan wanted her to spend a few hours each week with Ellie and Noah, not to teach, not to provide therapy, but simply to be present, to communicate with them in ASL, to play with them, to help them ease into the presence of someone from outside their insulated world. A kind of bridge, well compensated and scheduled outside her work hours, with transportation provided. Rachel fell silent for a long moment as Ellie's face flashed through her mind, those bright eyes igniting at her signs, that tiny hand waving goodbye as if it were the beginning of something. But interwoven with that memory was Jonathan's gaze. Cool, restrained, calculating. "Why me?" she asked softly. David did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice held a simple truth. "Because you did what no one in that house has ever managed to do." And the children responded. Rachel ended the call without accepting and without refusing, setting her phone on the table as she leaned forward, elbow to her brow, her thoughts tangled. Everything felt sudden. Part of her was pulled by instinct, by her understanding of how isolation could crush a deaf child's spirit, how access to the outside world could become salvation. But another part of her resisted, wary of stepping into the life of a man she knew nothing about, a man whose reasons for sealing himself and his children away were unclear, a man who had chosen her, an ordinary young woman, to cross a threshold guarded more tightly than any she had ever known. The adjoining door creaked open and Ethan peeked out, his hair mussed, his blue hearing aids set aside for the night. He signed, "You okay?" Rachel looked up and forced a small smile before shaking her head. Ethan sat across from her and traced shapes in the air. "Another stranger asking you to teach ASL." Rachel let out a soft laugh and signed, "Stranger than usual this time." She told him a simplified version of what had happened, leaving out sensitive details but enough for him to understand how unusual the offer was. When she finished, Ethan remained quiet for a moment before signing slowly. "Maybe they are the ones who need you." Rachel studied her brother's face, and in his eyes, she saw echoes of their childhood, the loneliness he had carried, the longing to be understood, and she knew Ethan was speaking not only of the children but also of their father. For an instant, something inside her shifted, a quiet recognition that perhaps he was right, that perhaps they did need her, but did she have the courage to step into that world? The next morning, when the sleek black SUV stopped before the towering iron gate glazed with white frost, Rachel swallowed hard as she stepped out, tugging her heavy coat close around her neck to brace against the bitter cold. The driver said nothing, simply motioning for her to follow. Before her stretched a vast private estate, the electronic gate sliding open to reveal a long stone path running straight through rows of ancient evergreens dusted with snow as fine as powdered sugar. At the end rose a mansion like an old fortress, immense and cold, its scale almost suffocating. Cameras tracked her with slow mechanical pivots, and in the shadowed corners, she saw men dressed in black with earpieces standing guard without a word. Rachel felt as though she had stepped out of the world she knew into a place where even her breath was recorded. The main door opened before she reached it, a uniformed woman greeting her with no smile, only a courteous gesture inviting her in. "Miss Carter, please follow me." Her voice was clipped and steady, like a pre-programmed recording. Rachel followed through a wide marble hall lined with perfectly aligned artwork. The silence was heavy, broken only by the click of her boots. Suddenly, near the end of the corridor, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a side door, blocking her path. It was Jonathan. Up close, he was more imposing than he had been in the restaurant, a wall of cold authority. He did not offer a hand. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, "you are here because my children asked for you. But make no mistake, you are entering a secure facility. One wrong move, one unapproved question, and you will be removed." The threat hung in the air, sharp and real. Rachel's heart hammered, but she thought of Ethan, and she thought of the lonely twins. She straightened her spine and met his gaze without flinching. "I am here to be a friend to your children, Mr. Rains, not to pry, but if you think I am a threat, send me home now." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, assessing her for a long, tense second. He was testing her, and she had not backed down. Finally, the tension in his shoulders dropped by a fraction. He stepped aside and gestured to the heavy oak door. "Don't make me regret this." Light poured into a room painted a soft yellow, with thick carpeting and toys scattered everywhere, train tracks, stuffed animals, building blocks, drawings taped across an entire wall. Two children sat with their backs to the door, absorbed in a half-built wooden railway, but within seconds Ellie looked up, her face lighting like dawn. She leapt to her feet and ran toward Rachel with such speed that even the attendant startled, and Noah hurried behind her holding an unfinished piece of Lego. Ellie threw her arms around Rachel's waist, hugging her tightly like a child greeting a long-lost relative, and Rachel froze for a heartbeat before bending to return the embrace. Noah said nothing, simply stepped close and grasped the fabric of her coat, his eyes bright with trust. The woman who had escorted Rachel hesitated, then slipped quietly out, leaving her alone with the children in a room that felt cut off from the rest of the mansion. Rachel sat down and signed slowly. "Hello, what would you like to do today?" Ellie immediately grabbed her hand and pulled her into the center of the room where a wooden city was half-built, and Noah pointed urgently at an unfinished tower needing help. Within minutes, Rachel was seated between them, building, signing, laughing, sliding seamlessly into their world as though she had belonged there all along. From the hallway, Jonathan watched through one-way glass, silent as a shadow, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding. He had no need to observe, yet he remained, something uneasy and unnameable stirring within him as he watched Ellie embrace a stranger with a tenderness she had never given anyone else, and saw Noah willingly touch someone who was not family, something he rarely did even with Miss Ellis. In a single meeting, Rachel had crossed every barrier Jonathan had constructed over 6 years, needing no charm, no strategy, no permission, only the natural grace of her hands and eyes. He knew he had been right to invite her, yet he also understood, perhaps for the first time, that allowing her in might alter the world he had fought so desperately to control, and he wondered with a cold flicker of fear whether, if she walked away tomorrow, his children would ever accept the fortress again. Rachel began the afternoon with ASL games she had invented, each sign linked to a playful motion or a tiny story that sent the children into fits of soundless laughter. Using toys around the room, she created animals, characters, and adventures, signing with such artistry that the once silent space filled with light, movement, and joy. Ellie squealed and waved her hands in wild excitement, signing so quickly Rachel had to lean forward to follow, and Noah laughed aloud for the first time, his shoulders trembling with delight. Jonathan watched, transfixed, seeing his son's face unguarded, seeing his daughter shimmer with a freedom he had not witnessed since Amelia's last breath. Something melted painfully inside him, a thin crack in the ice he had layered around his heart. David stood quietly nearby, his notes meticulous, and murmured to Jonathan, "She is doing what none of us can." Jonathan gave a faint nod, unable to tear his gaze from the ease with which Rachel guided the children, the spark she ignited with nothing more than her presence. Rachel continued weaving stories through signs, teaching the children vocabulary for food, games, emotions, turning every misstep into gentle laughter and every success into triumph. And soon Ellie and Noah were signing with effortless enthusiasm, as though dancing inside the language. Jonathan realized with a faint ache that 6 years of protection had stolen something vital from them, that in striving to keep them safe he had also kept them from joy, a truth that hit him like cold wind. Rachel, with patience, humor, and instinct, had opened a door he had believed forever locked. David noted quietly that, with the right approach, she could become a bridge between the outer world and the insulated realm Jonathan had created, a thought that unsettled Jonathan more than he expected. The afternoon unfolded in waves of laughter, soft light, and unrestrained discovery. The sterile chill of the mansion eased by the warmth of the 3 figures on the carpet, and for the first time in years Jonathan saw his children not as fragile beings to guard but as living spirits capable of wonder and belonging. A few days later, Rachel invited Ethan to the estate to play with Ellie and Noah, and though he hesitated at the mention of security, he agreed when Rachel described the colorful room and the children's eager anticipation, packing a small bag with toys and picture books for deaf children. The gate, the guards, the cameras initially overwhelmed him, but Rachel reassured him gently that this was simply the children's normal. Inside the playroom, Ellie launched herself at Ethan with a hug, Noah gripping his hand shyly but with curiosity, and Ethan smiled, introducing himself in steady, expressive signs, sharing stories of school, friends, challenges, joys, all of which the children absorbed with rapt attention. Rachel stayed close, helping them follow Ethan's stories, guiding them through unfamiliar signs, and Jonathan stood in the hallway, his heart tightening as he watched his children welcome someone from the outside world with such natural ease. He saw Ellie repeat Ethan's signs excitedly, saw Noah mimic movements with delighted concentration, and he sensed the power of connection that he himself had never been able to give them. Fear lingered, but alongside it came a slow understanding that the world beyond his gates was not exclusively perilous, that friendship and learning could be safe if approached with care. Gradually, Jonathan felt a long-held tension give way as he realized allowing Ethan to stay did not weaken their protection, but strengthened their growth. He observed in silence, studying Rachel's every motion, the gentleness in her corrections, the intuitive calm in her teaching, a kind of nurturing he had forgotten existed. Ethan spoke of school subjects, after-school clubs, and games he loved, and the playroom filled with the lively rhythm of hands in motion, a world both structured and free, so different from the rigid caution Jonathan had imposed. He remained silent, but with each passing moment he found himself letting go a little more, granting his children access to a life he had once believed too dangerous for them. No words passed between him and Rachel, yet one exchanged glance told him he had made the right decision in letting Ethan stay, that a wider world, guided with tenderness and vigilance, could exist for his children without destroying their safety. Rachel smiled. Ethan continued his story, and Ellie and Noah giggled with pure delight, and for the first time Jonathan witnessed joy that was neither restrained nor choreographed but real, unfiltered, and whole. After several weeks of watching Ellie and Noah blossom, Rachel paused one late afternoon and sat beside Jonathan in his dimly lit office where the pale light from the window traced sharp angles across his stern face, and she spoke with quiet conviction as she told him that the children needed the chance to meet their peers, to learn, to play, to feel the real world beyond these walls. Jonathan's brows tightened, his voice low and unyielding as he replied that he would not gamble with his children's lives, that any risk, even the smallest, could undo everything, that their safety was absolute and non-negotiable. Rachel breathed deeply and met his gaze with steady calm, trying to convey resolve without defiance as she said she understood his fear, but that keeping the children inside an iron cage would strip them of their childhood, joy, and their ability to connect with the world, that they needed to learn how to live, not merely survive. Jonathan rose and walked toward the window, staring out across the snow-covered grounds with a gaze distant but still hardened by years of vigilance. As he said, he knew the world outside, knew exactly what lurked there, knew how quickly a single oversight could be exploited, and he could not risk their lives for the sake of social niceties. Rachel knew she could not change his mind in that moment, but she did not yield to frustration as she reminded him that the children had laughed, had connected, had opened themselves to someone outside their family without harm, and with careful planning and proper supervision, their world could expand safely. Jonathan remained silent, his jaw fixed, his face unreadable. Rachel rose, tapped the edge of the desk gently, shouldered her backpack, and said she would continue teaching them, but if he wanted them to grow fully, the outside world was unavoidable, and she hoped he would consider it. Without waiting for a reply, she stepped into the long hallway lined with cold walls and immaculate paintings, her heart heavy yet steady, while Jonathan stood motionless behind her, watching the shadow of her figure fade into the muted light of the foyer, as the weight of her words pressed inward on a truth he had never dared confront, the truth that perhaps his absolute control was not love, but a barrier between him and the world his children needed. After she left, the playroom grew unbearably still, as Ellie quietly stacked wooden blocks at the table, her eyes drifting to the window where the snow drifted in slow spirals, while Noah stood beside her, gripping the table's edge with a hesitation and solemnity that did not belong to a child. The joy, the laughter, the sparkle that had filled the room only hours earlier vanished with Rachel's absence, and the silence settled like a sorrow neither of them could name. Jonathan watched from behind the one-way glass, his heart heavy as he realized for the first time in many years that the rigid, suffocating safety he had built had also dimmed the children's light. He saw the muted sadness in their eyes, the tentative way they moved, the quiet longing that Rachel had briefly lifted, and he felt an ache of doubt crack open inside him as he wondered whether his vigilance had protected them or imprisoned them. His tension slowly dissolved, replaced by a hollow sense of fear and awakening, as memories of their laughter with Rachel flickered through his mind. The fluent hands, the bright faces, the connection she had nurtured with such ease. His chest tightened as he watched them return to their familiar silence, realizing they still yearned for connection, that the world he had crafted for them was too small. After standing motionless for a long time, he finally drew a steady breath and reached for his phone, his fingers trembling faintly as he dialed the familiar number, pausing for a beat as the silence of the playroom merged with the sound of his own heartbeat before pressing the call button. Rachel, he realized, was the only bridge he had, the only one who could open a world beyond these walls, and he was ready, despite his fear, to ask her to return. The moment she answered, he felt the weight of his choice and the fragile hope that through her the children might find the joy they had been denied. The sadness in their faces urged him forward, and he understood there was no path left but to bring Rachel back so the children could not only learn, but live. The next morning, Rachel returned to the estate with a plan and 3 deaf children whom David had thoroughly vetted, ensuring every detail of safety and compatibility. The familiar playroom transformed into a lively gathering space, furniture rearranged to create wide-open areas for movement, toys added to spark creativity and collaboration. When the door opened, Ellie and Noah ran forward to greet their new friends, their eyes glowing, their smiles bright enough to warm the entire room. Rachel guided them through games and introductions, encouraging each child to sign their name, share a small story, play simple movement games that let them bond quickly, and soon the room filled with the vibrant motion of hands and the gleam of unrestrained joy. Jonathan watched from behind the glass, breath caught in his throat as he saw Noah laugh with a depth he had never heard, saw Ellie animatedly recount a story in signs as her eyes shone with pure delight, and he realized he was witnessing something new, the children living instead of merely existing. Freed for a moment from the shadow of his fears, Rachel stayed close, ensuring each child felt seen and understood, gently fostering their communication and confidence, guiding them toward one another with tenderness and a quiet strength that felt almost miraculous. Jonathan exhaled softly as the truth settled in his chest. His relentless protection had stifled their childhood and their capacity to connect, and Rachel had given them something he never could. A mixture of admiration and sorrow welled within him as he watched the children play freely, their hands painting stories in the air, their smiles unguarded. As the gathering came to an end, and the children shared silent goodbyes and bursts of laughter, Jonathan stood watching with a rare, fleeting smile touch his face, as he acknowledged privately that he had never seen Ellie and Noah so alive, so luminous, and that for the first time he understood the meaning of loosening his grip enough to let his children step into the world that awaited them. After an afternoon filled with laughter and the bright glow in the children's eyes, Miss Ellis sat beside Jonathan, her voice gentle yet unwavering, as she told him that Ellie and Noah had learned so much from Rachel, but that they now needed the chance to attend a real school, to meet peers, to navigate conflict, to discover the world beyond these protective walls, and that if they continued living under such intense sheltering, they would lose the chance to experience a full childhood. Jonathan remained silent as he watched the children play with their new friends, his heart tightening with each natural gesture, each unrestrained smile, a feeling both proud and powerless washing over him. Rachel, seated across from him, nodded in agreement as she said that the children had grown remarkably in just a few months, but without exposure to the outside environment, their progress would always remain limited, that they needed a place where they could learn safely, yet authentically, surrounded by peers. Jonathan drew a long breath, his mind replaying every moment of the play session, noticing the stark contrast between the years the children spent enclosed in fear and this present moment where they laughed freely, learned eagerly, and connected without hesitation. A part of him clung fiercely to the world he controlled completely, a world where every breath and every step of the children remained safeguarded, yet another part of him began to see that such control had turned them into sheltered souls inside a silent fortress, deprived of the natural experiences that shape a child's heart. He wrestled with the fear that had governed his life for so long, remembering dangers past, adversaries both real and imagined, the unpredictable risks that had once justified every locked door and every guard. And yet the image of Ellie's shining eyes and Noah's joyous hands stirred a different kind of fear within him, a fear of holding them back from the fullness of life. Sensing the turmoil in his gaze, Miss Ellis placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him to trust in what the children had learned, in the resilience they had already shown, reminding him that they were no longer fragile infants but capable young souls seeking connection and joy, and that allowing them to grow was not abandoning protection, but embracing a different form of love. Jonathan closed his eyes for a single beat, breathing in the rhythm of their laughter and their eager movement, understanding that sending them to school would not merely be an educational decision, but the first step toward opening the real world to them, letting them learn independence, letting them experience joy, disappointment, challenge, and social connection, all the things he had unknowingly taken away out of fear. Rachel looked at him with quiet hope, urging him to trust his children, assuring him that this first step would help them grow stronger. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked toward the window where the late afternoon sky dimmed, and the sight of Ellie and Noah playing with their new friends etched itself into his mind. He exhaled, feeling fear merge with hope, and at last a quiet resolve formed within him, the resolve to let the children step into the world, even if his heart remained wary, even if fear shadowed each breath, because this time the fear served purpose rather than confinement. The next morning, Jonathan drove slowly through familiar streets, his heart pounding as he approached the school for deaf children where Ellie and Noah would, for the very first time, learn, make friends, and experience the fullness of childhood. When the car stopped at the gate, the green of the playground, the cheerful signs, and the bright laughter of the students made the children's eyes widen and their small hands tremble with excitement. Ellie gripped his hand and signed softly that she loved him, and Jonathan bent down, offering a fragile yet heartfelt smile as he signed for her to be brave. Fear still churned inside him, a blend of imagined threats and memories of real danger, but a stronger current of trust began to rise as he watched Ellie and Noah take their first steps into the classroom, integrating smoothly, signing with friends and teachers with natural ease, their faces glowing with curiosity and joy he had not seen in 6 long years. Rachel stood nearby, pride shimmering quietly in her eyes, and Ethan was there too, signing small cues to the children, offering familiarity and comfort as a bridge between home and this new world. Jonathan stood motionless, realizing that the anxiety which once ruled him had softened into trust, that letting go ever so slightly had been the right and necessary choice. When the children walked away toward their classroom, they looked back at him with radiant smiles, and he felt an invisible thread tug gently between father and child as he released a long breath. Fear still lived within him, but trust outweighed it, and for the first time he believed they could face challenges, discover joy, build friendships, and grow into their true selves. 3 months later, the garden before the Rains estate overflowed with children's laughter, as Ellie and Noah ran through the grass with other deaf children Rachel had introduced, their hands moving in effortless conversation, their bodies loose and joyful, fully belonging to the world around them. The light in their eyes, the ease of their play, and the spark of curiosity in every gesture reflected the childhood they had once been denied. Jonathan sat on a bench beside Rachel, watching his children with a heart filled with both relief and pride as he saw them share stories, help one another, learn from friends, and embrace the world with an openness he once feared would destroy them. For the first time in many years, he understood that true strength did not lie in walls or security teams, but in the love and trust he allowed himself to place in his children. When he murmured that they were not his weakness, Rachel answered with a gentle smile that they were his strength. In that moment, Jonathan realized that every fear he had once clung to had lost its hold, that his children had become his reason to open the gates of his guarded world and let life seep in. Watching them grow, communicate, explore, and laugh under Rachel's guidance, he understood that love tempered with patience and trust could transform a family's destiny. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share the video so you can join us for many more stories each day, and we would love to hear how this story resonates with your own life, so feel free to comment and share your thoughts. We wish you health, joy, and peace each day, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.